and share a little bit a story of the picture. Right? You begin to create space for knowing each other. The other thing, I go to Blair Street United Church in Toronto, and I have my favorite space up in the balcony. My minister can always tell if I'm in church because she can look up and see if I'm in the balcony. I'm one of those people who, when I'm in the pulpit, I encourage people not to sit in the same place, but when I'm in church, I'm always in the same place. But I always have my cell phone in my hand, and one of the things I do two things with my cell phone on Sunday morning, or three things with my cell phone on Sunday morning. One is I take pictures, and I post them. And part of it is to say, here I'm part of a community that I really appreciate being in. I'm always careful, so oftentimes you'll see my pictures and you don't necessarily see people's face. Because where I sit, I can take pictures and you only see the back of people's head. I never take pictures of children. I just don't think that's appropriate unless you get permission from parents. And I do that. And my friends know that that is partly because I value being in the community where I am. And so it's important. The second thing I do is I tweet. Now I know that Twitter is not everybody's cup of tea, but one of the things I do in tweeting is if I hear something, either in the music, in the sermon, in a scripture, and a thought comes to mind, I tweet it out, and I tag it to the church. And the third thing I do is I use it for my Bible. I have a Bible app on it, and when the scriptures are being read in church, I'll go on my app and follow the scriptures. We're not as sophisticated as you are, even though we're an urban church. We don't use overhead projectors to put the words of the order of service and stuff on it. So scripture is usually read, and rather than picking up the Pew Bible, I use my phone. And it's interesting to be able, because then I can switch version and I can follow along in a different version than's being read. But what it does is that it allows me to get the word out to my followers on Facebook or Twitter that I'm part of a community that has value to me. And oftentimes we don't use technology in a way that is helpful to tell the story of our involvement in the communities that we're involved in. Right? I find church folks, you may invite me to a supper, but we very reluctantly just invite people to come to church with us because it's an important space for us. We don't do that. And it's like going and seeing a movie that's so powerful and you come home and you never tell anybody about the movie you've seen. Right? So if this place and being with these people are important to you, you need to share that. And technology is one of the ways to be able to share that. So we need to risk. The two other things around technology is that we can use technology to share what's going on. So I've some friends who used to live in Toronto, was a member of a congregation in Toronto. They no longer, they moved to South America. And fortunately, the congregation they're a part of live streamed the service on Sunday morning. And so although they live in South America and is no longer a part of the community that they used to attend in Toronto, they go to worship every Sunday with a community that they used to be attached to in Toronto through technology, live streaming. And so they participate in worship. And that's part of the risking of the future. The future is a future that calls us to embrace technology. We have 5 congregations in Northern Ontario. 3 of the congregations are without ministry personnel, and they are small congregations, typical rural congregations. So the city church in Thunder Bay has set up a network with the 5 congregations. And every Sunday morning, they worship together, all 5 congregations, in their respective building. The sermon comes from one place. The anthem comes from another place. The scripture reading comes from another place. The prayers of the people come from another place. And so you have the whole 5 churches worshiping together every Sunday morning, each community contributed to the worship experience, and they do it through technology. We, in the National Church, invested $30,000. We gave them a grant of $30,000 to make that happen. And it's another way of being church, because then folks who are shut in, if they have the capacity, they can connect, right? So it's an important way to think about how do we be church of the future. A church of the future will require us risk-taking, and one of the risk-taking space is through the use of technology. The other thing around risking in technology, and I'm not a good example of it this morning, right? I'm not a good example of it this morning, because our culture has become a visual culture. And we, and particularly we in the United Church, are a wordy culture. We love words. Right? What if, and this is a possibility, so what if we use the technology to be more visual? What if every time I had an illustration to talk about at the point of my sermon, there was a clip, a movie clip up, right? So my kids, 2 young kids, who I always said whenever they went to church and went to Sunday school, they went back 50 years in time. Because in their classroom, my son and his friends were they're Mac geeks, and my son at the time was probably 5 or 6, and he and his friends were using their computers to make animated shorts. And when they come to church, they sit around and somebody speaks at them, and there's no opportunity for them to engage. So part of the future for us, and part of the risk-taking, is that we have to take seriously the presence of technology in our lives. And we need to figure out how to use technology to communicate in a way that will engage people. The fact is, those of us who continue to come to church, continue to come because we are people who are comfortable with a certain way of being church. And it's harder and harder to find people like us who are willing to come and sit, hear a bunch of words, have somebody talk at them for 10, 15, 20 minutes, and then go out. People are antsy. They need ways. And so the disciples had to risk, move beyond what they were comfortable with to what was new. The other risk taken that I just want to lift up is this, is that we need to be global. We need to be global. I know that there are some unique challenges that rural communities face and rural congregations face. In the Canadian context, we tend to think we are alone. And every rural community I go into, their challenges, they think they're the only one facing those challenges. And that their challenges are unique. I want to tell you, when you go across the globe and meet people in rural communities, in Zimbabwe, in the Philippines, in India, in Ghana, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and you see people in rural communities who meet out in the open under trees. We don't have a challenge here. So part of our future means that we need to connect globally. We need to understand and discover what others are doing to face the challenge that we are facing and recognize we're not alone. So what if this congregation were to partner with one of our partners overseas in a rural context and begin to learn from how they face their challenges in the rural context? We have to risk. So we have to admit that what we're doing isn't working. We need to risk. But the third and final thing I want to say in terms of our future is this: that what God is birthing, and I honestly believe that we're not in the context of the tomb, but we're in the context of the womb. God is birthing something. And what God is birthing for us and in us is that we would be a people who would be attentive to the voice of Jesus. That attentiveness requires discernment. So the disciples didn't know it was Jesus, right? The text is playing a little bit of game with us when we read the text. They didn't know it was Jesus. They heard someone say to them, throw the nets on the other side. And they did. And they experienced a miracle. And as they experienced that miracle, they began to recognize who it was that was in their presence. That Jesus was in their presence. We in the Christian church have become Pauline Christians, not Jesus Christians. We have developed a form of Christianity that's based on the teaching of Paul and not on the ministry of Jesus. And the church, what God is birthing in us, is a reclamation, a reclaiming of our understanding of the ministry of Jesus and a discernment, a listening voice to the ministry of Jesus. And that's an important piece for us. How do we begin to discern and listen to the voice of Jesus? And as we do that, we begin to live like Jesus lived. So let me end with a couple of illustrations. So this is I understand that the community around you is a very artistic community. Right? There are a lot of artists, artisans in the community. So what if we were like Jesus and we went to where people were? So what if, rather than worshiping in this place with all its history and all that it has to offer to us, we went to a studio and asked an artist to paint the text and have some conversation about that? What if? What if we went to one of the farms and had worship out in the open on a farm, thinking about God's care for creation, God's way of engaging us, wife. Right? So if we become folks who will be attentive to Jesus, that which is being birthed within us will be different. And I suspect in that space, we might engage people in a different kind of way than we expect them to come in. One of the things I find as I travel across the United Church is that once you walk through the threshold of the doors, you will find people who are graciously welcoming and loving. But you never know it until you walk across the threshold. And that's a lot of expectation for people who aren't familiar with what. If you come in, you will be welcomed. Maybe what we're being called to do in the 21st century are people who will get out on the other side of the building and be where Jesus is, in the midst of God's creation, among God's people, sharing God's care and love. May you find the courage for the next chapter of your history to be those kinds of people. Amen.